everyone. I am David Mandel at Ohel tonight on Ohel's Zoom. It's part of our continuing dialogue with the community, with all of you folks watching and listening, dealing with the issues of COVID. And we hope sometime soon to be able to move into many other conversations. These are Zoom is the conversation that we have with families, with schools, the community, how to respond, how to deal, and as much as possible, how to stay safe and positive during this difficult time. Tonight's conversation, this topic, is titled The Revolving Door of COVID, handling schools reopening, closing, quarantine, and remote learning. We're very happy to be joined by Dr. Mark Kirschenbaum, a noted pediatrician and Ohel's medical consultant, as well as Dr. N Blumenthal, Ohel's Director of Trauma and Crisis Response. I would like to thank Sivi Ryder, Ohel's Director of Children's Services, and Cheryl Jarnowski for preparing tonight's Zoom conversation on COVID. We ask everyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment to please use your chat box or email to copingwithcovid19@ohelfamily.org. Spell it out, copingwithcovid19@ohelfamily.org. This evening is being co-sponsored with Hidden Sparks. We welcome and very proud to be co-sponsoring this evening's conversation. Next week, Tuesday evening on the 29th, please tune in also. We have another conversation before Sukkot with Rabbi Moshe Weinberger, the Rav of Eish Kodesh in Woodmere, and Dr. Norman Blumenthal on the issue of an emptier sukkah. Not an empty sukkah of our thoughts and emotions, but possibly an emptier sukkah of some people that we normally invite to our sukkah and how we can deal with that issue. We know from the response that we received coming up to this evening, we received many questions from individuals that have been submitted. Again, anyone, as the conversation goes along, first we're going to call on Dr. Kirschenbaum, followed by Dr. Blumenthal, and then we will take your questions. Use the chat box function or email to copingwithcovid19@ohelfamily.org. Just yesterday and today, we've all heard some information that CDC published on whether or not COVID is airborne. They published it, it was a draft, it was retracted, it's confusing. Everyone waited quite some time for schools to reopen, an entire summer. Some camps opened, some camps didn't. Some day camps opened, some didn't. Certainly parents were eagerly waiting, as well as students. This may be one of the first few times in history that kids were actually waiting to go to school. And school started, and then some of the schools closed or classes quarantined. It's a little bit confusing to people. We hope to be able to enlighten you with some information this evening that we are not preempting any decision made by any school. We are not preempting any decision made in your workplace, whichever company, organization, or business you work with. What we are hoping to do this evening is to provide some information, provide some clarity, give you some choices, and especially dealing with uncertainty. With that, let me introduce Dr. Mark Kirschenbaum, a noted pediatrician and Ohel's medical consultant. Dr. Kirschenbaum.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction. Obviously, already some of the points that you've touched upon is what I planned on talking about tonight. I feel like every single time we've done these Zoom sessions, it seems to be in a different environment, all related to COVID, obviously, but at different times along the COVID journey that we're all currently on as a community. The point that I'd like to talk about are some of the points of confusion that are affecting all of us. I'm going to bring them up, and hopefully I won't bring out any more anxiety that we already have, but I would like to touch upon them. The first is whether or not to test. There's been a lot of controversy regarding this particular issue, who to test and when to test. And the CDC, like David mentioned earlier, who's right now has taken a lead role for us in the medical community, for us locally in New York City and New York State, for the doctors, regarding policy for us, in which we can then give it over to the people, schools and shuls. And they themselves, this past Friday afternoon around 5 o'clock, completely changed their point of view. So that's a big area of confusion, which I was personally happy to see. I'm always happy when a big organization has enough confidence and in order to switch a major policy of theirs. But they did switch it, and that caused a lot of confusion. And it definitely made me question what I've been telling patients for the last couple of, I'd say, last 2 to 3 weeks. How long to isolate and quarantine is another major point of confusion for folks. Normally we say 10 and 14. Isolation, if you have COVID, is 10 days. Quarantining, if you have a primary contact with someone with COVID, it's going to be 14 days. Now, there are some doctors who are mentioning some other days that the CDC does not mention, like 5 days and 8 days. I've seen some doctors or some publications mention 21 days. Another point of confusion is, where does antibodies play a role in isolation and or quarantine? Post-exposure, when to test, is another major issue for some folks. You come in contact on a Sunday with someone that has confirmed coronavirus. When do you then get tested when is the testing itself, in order that you know that you feel comfortable saying you do not have coronavirus? The last issue that I'd like to bring up is masks and social distancing, and that's really where you see some folks have the most strong opinions. Whether or not to wear masks. If we do wear masks, you wear them in all social situations and only in some social situations. And then it brings on the social distancing issue as well. Do we social distance with family members, distant relatives, school, work? And we weigh out masks and social distancing constantly regarding financial concerns, whether or not it affects your ability to work and earn a living. So all these points of confusion that we're talking about over here, they play a role in the second point that I'd like to get to tonight, which really is, for many of these issues that we're talking about, there are some facts involved and there are many opinions. And obviously the medical community does not have any answers. They don't have any absolute answers to any of these issues that I'm bringing up, because if it would, we'd be done with COVID. And unfortunately, we are not finished with COVID. So at this point, doctors and lay people are getting information at the same time. Obviously, a doctor is trained in the way to decipher or go through this information and to be able to funnel it in an understandable manner that we can then go ahead and promote a public health policy in the most reasonable way forward. But we're all getting the information at the same time in real time, and this is the first time that I know of that this has happened. So this leads to very strong individual opinions. That means your average lawyer accountant will have as strong of an opinion on coronavirus as much as a doctor. And many of the doctors with the strongest opinions are those that are in the minority, medically speaking. There's a medical community, and I'd say within the medical community, those that do not agree with CDC or DOH guidelines, they've become very vocal, and people are listening to them. And for many folks out there that share similar opinions, it's just validating their own personal opinions. And one of the issues I want to talk about was that your personal opinion on coronavirus matters to you, matters to your family, maybe your extended family. but really it's the opinion of the community that matters most. So the rabbi of your shuls, his opinion on coronavirus matters in the shul. It's his shul. The rabbi, the principal of the school, his or her opinion on coronavirus. For your child being in school, that's the opinion that matters most. And if you're in a community where you're lucky enough to have one or two doctors who have taken a leadership role within, with regards to COVID, then how you act in a pizza store, grocery store, social situations, simchas, then that local doctors, whether it's a publication or some sort of policy that they put out, WhatsApp or email, then that's the opinion that matters most within the community. Hopefully, all these people that I'm mentioning, local doctors, rabbis, principals, hopefully their opinion is based on a collaborative effort regarding input from many different avenues of people. But if we all follow the same rules, really, that will enable us to get the best results. And this brings me to my third point. When I mention results, what are the end results? What are the results? Results really drive our actions during times of need. When we're in the middle of a pandemic, it seems to be, there's definitely an uptick right now. So to me, I'd say 6 months ago, 6 months ago, obviously we were dealing with something that we never knew about, and it was really novel coronavirus. And unfortunately, many people were getting sick and dying. So the morbidity and mortality was significantly higher than we're seeing right now. The reason for that is up for debate. Another point of confusion is it the same coronavirus? Has the virus itself sort of changed a little bit, that it's less severe? We don't know the answers to that. But for most of us sitting on this chat right now, as long as you're not immunocompromised, not dealing with any major medical issues within your immediate family, that to me, the most important primary concern of all of us is keeping the schools open. Our kids need to go to school, learn, have appropriate social interactions, and adults and parents need to go to work. And that's really that's paramount at this very moment to me. And this is really a new reality going into, as David said, next week we're going to be talking about Sukkot, and then Simchas Torah, and then we have Hanukkah and Purim. So we, in the medical world, like right now I'm dealing with enterovirus quite a bit. It's a different virus. It's causing a lot of people to have fever, shaking, chills, not feeling good, coughing. Enterovirus. Around the corner, Sukkot time, you mentioned to a pediatrician, we think of RSV season. RSV season almost always leads into flu season. And while this is all happening, that we're discussing COVID virus, coronavirus, we're also dealing with the usual strep throat, ear infections, pneumonias, UTIs, you name it. We're still dealing with it. So it's important to remember that keeping our schools open, even though there's these illnesses going on, is paramount. That is, to me, the most important takeaway from that I would like to talk about. Now, as a global community, following the rules will give us really all the best chance for schools to remain open. Medically and regarding life-saving measures for people who are really sick in the hospital with coronavirus, there's still much debate, unfortunately, and there really isn't a consensus regarding that. Baruch Hashem, today we know much more than we did 6 months ago, but there's still plenty of debate. But what I do know is that if we do follow the same rules, whatever they may be, some schools may have one set of rules that sort of at times can seem to conflict with another school set of rules. But I believe firmly that if we all follow our school's set of rules, or our community set of rules, or our schools set of rules, and don't think of ourselves as an individual who can, I don't have to listen to those rules, they don't apply to me because I have antibodies, the rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about, the principal doesn't know what he's talking about, that's really where we run into trouble and we become our own worst enemy, and we start affecting the other people within that community. And even if you don't agree with it, even if you have an opinion, it may be right, it may be wrong. And I'm a doctor saying, I don't know who's right and I don't know who's wrong. But what I do know, if there's consistency, that'll give us our best path going forward.
Dr. Kirschenbaum, we normally think of flu shots for adults. What are you advising your patients about flu shots for children?
So this is a point of contention for many doctors. Again, pediatricians many times feel different about flu shots than some other doctors. I'm a pediatrician, and I strongly encourage everyone to always get the flu shot, the flu vaccine, every year. it doesn't really do a good job at preventing you from getting the flu, but it does a fantastic job at preventing you from ending up in the ICU, so getting really sick from the flu, and it prevents you from spreading it to other people. So at a time like this, where every child who has fever is corona until proven otherwise, I'd say the ability to prevent spread of flu during this upcoming winter is paramount. So please, 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 I encourage and please everyone to get their flu shots this year. Best time to get the flu shot is between now and I'd say mid to end of October. So you got another like month and a half. That's the ideal time to get it.
Dr. Kirschenbaum highlighted that isolation is a 10-day period. For those individuals who come into contact with someone who tested positive for COVID, it's a 14-day period. He emphasized the point of dealing with strong individual opinions and then balancing that with opinions of community and school leaders, and then blending that or incorporating that into your own thinking, so that how do you deal with conflicting opinions? How do you deal with conflicting information? As in every other situation in life, you listen to all the facts and then you make sense, what makes sense for you, for your family, and of course asking those individuals whom you believe are your advisors, is your counsel, whether or not that's another family member, your physician, your Rav, anyone else, but incorporating all that information to do what's best for you and your family. Thank you very much, Dr. Kirschenbaum. We have a number of questions that have been posed that will come back to you in a few minutes. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. N Blumenthal, Director of Ohel's Trauma and Crisis Response. Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, David. Everybody hear me? Okay, good. All right. Having raised 4 children, I'm used to people not listening to me. But okay, I'm glad to be here that I'm being listened to. First of all, I want to again, as always, I like to quote the rabbi of the community where I grew up, who used to begin his sermon with, "Before I speak, I want to say something." So before I speak, I also want to say something. I want to thank, first and foremost, Ohel, our CEO, David Mandel, and our presidium, Jay Kestman, Mel Zachter, and my coworkers, many of them, but most notably, Zevi Wright and Cheryl Chernovsky, that really make it possible for us to do this kind of very important work. And it's also an honor to share the podium with Dr. Kirschenbaum. As you can see, he's not only a consummate professional, but he's crisp and clear on matters that he brings up. And I've always enjoyed listening to him and gained from it. And also, it's a very special privilege to share this evening with Hidden Sparks, an organization that everybody should be well aware of, an organization that really, in significant ways, enhances the quality and the professional level of teachers in our schools. And it's a very important role, and what's more important than educating our children, and it's truly an honor to share this evening with them. As David said, I welcome you to use the chat options. We have a large group. I think last count was 86 people on, which means that there's probably about 20 people paying attention, but I invite you to, it's very hard to just have people unmute themselves and ask questions, so I invite you to use the chat option. If you have questions, comments, you can do the chat one of 3 ways. You can just post it where everybody knows that you're the one asking the question, if that's okay with you. If you want to do it privately, please send it to David Mandel or to the Ohel Partner Resilience, so that they're the only ones. I would say probably to David, who's hosting tonight. So send it privately to him so he can ask the question without divulging who's asking. And if you have a particular issue that you don't even want to have it publicized, but you want to bring it up, then also mention that in the chat, and we'll follow up afterwards. We've been through some tough times these past few months, and certainly we as the trauma team in Ohel have had, like many other organizations, have had our hand on the pulse. But in many respects, this has been the most difficult. It might be an easier time for the physicians, as Dr. Kirschenbaum indicated. We're getting a better handle on how to treat the disease and what to expect, etc. We still have a while to go, I'm sure, but psychologically, in terms of the level of tension and even the acrimony that has existed in our community, this I think has been the worst time. And I think there's several reasons for that. First of all, we're exhausted. This has been going on now for 6 months, and we don't see an end in sight. And I think many people are afraid, and they're really at the end of the ropes with this. The other thing is that again, we're fraught with uncertainty, and it's a point that I often mention, and I apologize for those who are repeat offenders on our webinars, that if I'm repeating myself, that it's the uncertainty itself breeds anxiety. I think I often mention as an example people who are awaiting test results after, let's say, a cancerous tumor has been surgically removed, and we're dealing with this as trauma team as well, and they ultimately get bad results. They get the results that suggest that the cancer has spread, will tell us that that is easier than that waiting period when they didn't know. Maybe even a more dramatic example I just thought of is, I can tell you from my mother, Allah Shalom, who was a survivor of 7 concentration camps, who was deported very early to Auschwitz, and before there were selections, and she knew she was going to die. She even knew from what her number was that she was scheduled to be gassed in June, and she arrived, I believe, around January to Auschwitz. And she describes that time period as a very sad period, that her life would end at 17, and she would think about so much of life that she's going to miss out on. But she wasn't anxious. There was a certainty. She knew. She knew in 6 months, whatever, that she's going to die. And it wasn't, because then she didn't know that there would ultimately be selections and she would be selected for labor. But you know, sometimes when you know for sure, even if it's hard, even if it's bad, if we had a crystal ball, if we had prophetic vision and we knew exactly how this school year is going to play out, is it going to be quarantine, not quarantine, is the school year going to last, are there going to be selective quarantines of sorts, are we going to have a hybrid model of Zoom and in person? If we knew for sure, we could prepare ourselves accordingly, but we don't. And this is what itself is breeding a great deal of tension. So what I want to propose for you is 2, if you will, mental templates, how to handle this upcoming year, and particularly how to handle children going to school and whether they're going to last a year and whether they're going to, you know, all these questions and what kind of impact this year is going to have. And I'm proposing 2 templates, not because I think you have a choice. I'm proposing 2 templates because I think, using very broad strokes, we can divide people into 2 categories. And one will be suited to one group and the other will be suited to another group. My friend and colleague and teacher, I would even say, David Pelkovitz, often talks about 2 types of responses to trauma. And he talks about attenders and distractors. And I think it's a very good way of putting it. There are some people who, when they're in difficult situations, need to know what's going to be. It's very important for them to be able to foresee what's going to happen, how this is going to play out. And then there are others who really say, listen, I don't care, I don't want to know, I'm just, whatever happens, I'm going to deal with it, and I don't have to know what's coming up. And each is there's not that one is right and one is wrong, that each is doing what's right for them. They're different. And each is coping in the manner and fashion that's correct for them. Physicians will tell me, and I guess Dr. Kirschenbaum can possibly confirm this, but some patients, you tell them they need a certain procedure, no sooner do they hear it, they Google it, and they find out all about it, and they walk into the office and say, why are you doing that procedure? Why aren't you doing it the way they're doing it in Houston? And how about that new technique they developed in Japan? And you know, overnight, they suddenly know as much as the expert on the subject, and they want to know exactly what's going to happen and what's the recovery going to be like and how long and what medications. And other patients, the doctor starts explaining things to them, and they say, listen, doc, whatever you do, I don't care. You know what you're doing. Don't tell me. Whatever it is, I'll deal with it. And each is right for themselves. So I'm going to propose to you a style of coping with this year for the attenders and for the distractors, okay? And each can sort of fit where exactly they fall and what works for them. We'll start with the attenders, the people who really need to know. And this is very difficult. We really have no idea what's down the pike, and how do they cope with this tremendous uncertainty? Can they go back to work? Will their children be sent home? Will all the children be sent home? Are we going to be back on Zoom? Are we going to last through the year? Is this going to be a productive year? I mean, will my children be allowed to play with other children? But, you know, with all this uncertainty, those who need to know. What I'm going to propose to you is what's often referred to as contingency planning. And we use this, I'll tell you other situations in which we use it, but contingency planning is probably more commonly associated with industry and the military, which is that you you don't have one plan, you don't have one anticipation, you have several anticipations depending what happens, but you're prepared for a number of eventualities. So if you're, let's say, an investor, or if you have a large corporation, so you have one plan in case the economy goes up, you have another plan if the economy goes down, you have one plan if natural resources become expensive, another plan if natural resources become more affordable. You have one plan if President Trump wins the election. You have another plan if Biden wins the election, and if nobody wins the election, you have several contingencies, and you're going to be prepared for each one. So you can't have one sort of set of preparation, but you have several ways of preparation. It's almost like there are several doors in front of you, and when you need to, you walk into whichever door happens to be applicable. We did the situation before COVID where we would propose this is people, again, who had, let's say, some very dangerous, serious medical condition, and there could be all sorts of eventualities. You can try this medication. If this medication doesn't work, we can leave it alone and take a blood test. We can do this surgical procedure. Well, there's a 40% chance it'll work. There's a 20% chance it won't work. There's another percent. As my colleague, one of my colleagues likes to say, 5 out of 4 psychologists don't know math. So if my math is a little bit off, please understand. But the family comes to us and they're frantic. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Will be this, will be A, B, C, D. And what we do with them is, okay, let's set up 4 possibilities. And you're prepared now for whatever will happen, because as it happens, you have that door in which you can walk into. So I would tell the attenders, the people who need that certainty, who need to have a better handle on what is held out for this year, is play out various scenarios. This is what I'm prepared to do if the year works out. This is what I'm prepared to do if the school is shut down. This is what I'm going to do if the school isn't shut down, but my child is sent home for 2 weeks. Be prepared for as many eventualities we can anticipate. And then you don't have that certainty that you might have. And look, if you're, before all this COVID happened, you might have been thinking about, what am I going to do for my summer vacation? Nobody dreamed that we wouldn't have a summer vacation. Or if your child was leaving to Israel for yeshiva seminary, you were preparing for that. You didn't anticipate that it would be so complicated. So usually you have just one path you have to go down. But now you may have 4 or 5 paths, but you have paths. I'm reminded of the famous line from Alice in Wonderland, that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So we know where you're going, but you have several different choices, and let that be the certainty that you need. And then I said, and then we have the distractors, the kind of people who say, I can't think about it. It's going to make me crazy. Whatever happens, I'll deal with it. I don't want to know. I'm just going to be ready. Whatever, I'll wake up in the morning and whatever's facing me, I'm going to deal with it. And again, for some people, that's the ideal approach. Just like for other people, planning is just the ideal approach. And the interesting thing in terms of the difference between the two is, for the attender, they have a future orientation. They need to know. They're thinking ahead. For the distractor, the best approach is to think in the past. If you're just going to let life take you wherever it takes you. Imagine you're on a sailboat and just there's strong winds, you have no control, and just wherever the wind takes you, that's where you're going to go. Then you need to reference the past, and you need to reference previous situations which you were in, where you handled it, so that can relieve some of your anxiety. So even though you have no idea how this year is going to play out, and you don't know how you're going to go back to work, or how you're going to keep your job if your kids are going to be sent home, and your boss about had it with your working from, how are you going to handle all this? And you don't have those 5 doors in front of you, then you can just say, look, I handled things in the past. We had remember when this happened. Remember when Hurricane Sandy happened. Remember when I lost my job. Or for that matter, even reference us as our survival historically. We got through, we created the state of Israel. We got through the Holocaust. We got through the pogroms. We got through the bloodline. We're resilient. And reference that past and then just let whatever life dishes out to you, let it dish out to you. And again, that find the place, it might be some mixture thereof, but find your place and find there's not one right way. There's the right way for you. And that's, by the way, so important in trauma, because in extreme circumstances, we rely on what works for ourselves. And it's very important that we know ourselves and recognize what kind of coping, so what's a perfect coping mechanism for one person may be a disaster for another person. But find your right type of coping. Sometimes, as an example, I give, imagine there's a carpenter and he has to build, and he wants to build a tool shed. So he can experiment with different ways of building and try different materials. He can try different approaches. Worst thing happens, tools get wet. But if he's adding on a, let's say, extension on his house, he's not going to experiment. He's going to work with what he knows works, because he can't take chances there. And the same thing is true with us. When we have nominal problems, we can experiment with different ways of coping. But when we have big problems, we rely on what works for ourselves. And therefore, you have to find what works for you. The big problem, by the way, sometimes is when an attender is married to a distractor, or a distractor is married to an attender. And of course, the way God made the world, where we weren't meant to marry clones of ourselves. It's inherent to marriage that there is difference, and difference is what enriches marriage. And certainly then in those kind of circumstances, you may have to either find your middle ground or respect each other's unique way of coping and not try to impose your way on the other person. Now, again, with all of this, it's very important that, and we're going to use the old metaphor we've used again and again about the airplane putting the oxygen on yourself before the child. Find your place. Find your coping mechanism. Have your narrative about how you're going to handle this year, and before you discuss it with your child, because there is nothing, and I guarantee you that you can have any approach you want. It can be the most, harebrained kind of approach. But nothing is worse when the child senses the anxiety in the parent, or senses that the parent is not themselves. And so therefore, put yourself in the right place, prepare yourself for this year, use whatever techniques work for you, and then discuss it with the child. The child is going to be scrutinizing you, especially with all the tension that's out there. And if they sense that you have an approach, you don't have all the answers, because nobody has all the answers, but you have an approach, they'll be okay with that as well. Another thing very important, which we're seeing out there, and I think we really have to discuss this, we're all very stressed, and this is a very difficult time. Avoid scapegoating. Avoid, because there's this anger out there, there's accusations, as Dr. Kirschenbaum indicated, there's not clarity, even in the medical field. And I think it's very interesting that he mentioned how the physicians are getting information at the same time as the general population. I think we're going to see more and more of that. In the age of information, it's very hard to be selective about who gets information. They may understand it a lot better than we do, but we're not always ready to admit that. But we're going to see that the selective part, portioning of information is really probably a thing of the past. As I mentioned, it's even today, it used to be that if you had to see a physician for some sort of special, you had to see really a specialist, you're at their mercy, whatever they told you. Today, you can have I even have a member of my family who has a very rare condition. And as soon as I got the name, I Googled it, and I can't say I knew as much as a specialist, but I knew a whole lot more than I would have before there was Google. And so the whole quality of the relationship between physicians and the general population is changing in general. But we're frustrated, and and the interesting thing is the research shows that when people are dealing with a lot of uncertainty and destabilizing uncertainty, in other words, it's not that you forgot the recipe for your aunt's Luxemkugel. When we're dealing with an uncertainty about something that so impacts on our lives, there's a tendency to gravitate towards extreme solutions or totalitarian types of solutions, to look for absolute truths or absolute approaches that aren't, and to do away with the nuance that very often is necessary to understand something in life. And therefore, we're finding this fragmentation, we're finding this kind of acrimony, and we have to be careful. None of us really know. And none of us really have totally the answers. And keep ourselves in check in terms of, look, we're certainly entitled to govern how we conduct our home. And certainly, as David mentioned and Dr. Kirschenbaum mentioned, the community leaders especially, and the experts will dictate for us, and we should more or less, especially within let's say the confines of our synagogue and our community, adhere to those standards. But let's not be so judgmental and engage in finger pointing. That's a natural reaction to such high stress, but it's merely a way of trying to cope with the stress and not necessarily a way to find solutions. The other thing I want to remind you, and this is extremely important as we prepare for this school year, is that children aren't China dolls. And again, I'm sure Dr. Kirschenbaum, as a pediatrician, can attest to it. I have to tell you, people sometimes ask me how I can do this kind of trauma work, and it's so painful and it's so difficult. And one of my answers is, along with so much pain, I see such incredible resilience and strength. It's really inspiring, and no more so than from children. I know sometimes when parents call me because there's some sort of crisis in the home and it just happened and they're frantic and worried about their children, I often tell them, 6 months from now, you're going to call me back and say, I just can't believe how my kids handled it. I can't just believe the creativity and the imaginative way in which my children manage to take care of their needs and cope with this stressor. And again, as we worry about how the year's going to go, trust your children's strengths, trust your own strengths. But particularly trusted children's strengths, they'll cope, they'll adapt, they'll find a way to make it work. Other thing is also in anticipation of the fact that we might be resuming to whatever degree some of the Zoom learning. In fact, it's interesting. I'm seeing how this kind of remote learning is creeping in even when school is open. And someone told me that there's not going to be snow days anymore because why if it snows, so we'll do Zoom. So we. And maybe the best guess is that we're going to have some sort of hybrid model this year. That's going to be some mixture of Zoom and face-to-face learning. And so there's no question, there's no doubt, even the research shows that till now the Zoom instruction has not been as effective as face-to-face instruction. Now, that might be because it's just not as good, or it might be that we haven't quite mastered it yet. I know I've spoken about this in other webinars. I'm just going to mention it quickly, that one of the reasons why the Wright brothers were able to invent the airplane is because prior to that, people were trying to get machines to fly like birds. They tried to get the machine to fly like a machine. And the reason why Deep Blue was able to beat anyone else in chess was because prior to that, people were trying to get computers to play chess like a human. And finally, they figured out that you have to get people to play, they have to get the computer to play chess like a computer. It's entirely possible that remote learning can be effective. We haven't quite mastered it yet. And I think the mistake is to think about remote learning as just like being in the classroom, but it's on a computer. It's unique, it's distinct. And we're going to have to, it may very well be part of our instruction even when this is over. So we should focus on that and see how we can make it effective. But one more thing I want to tell you, it's much harder for children, some children in particular, to learn this way. Please avoid conflict with all this tension. We don't need fights and this, worries, etc. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to put my license on the line and tell you this with certainty, that in the future, the fact that the home was a civil home, was a relaxed home, is probably going to hold the child in more good stead than if they know more algebra or less algebra. So keep that in mind as if there is portions of the year, or hopefully not, but even if we have to resort back to full-time remote learning, that the family harmony is more important. And remember, this will end. All crises, wars, pandemics, do ultimately end. Things change. I mean, the Knicks may yet win the championship. I don't know, but life is not static. And sometimes when it seems unbearable, you just have to sort of, it's like going for root canal. It's not going to be the rest of your life. It's going to be the next half hour or so. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. It will end. And one more suggestion, and I think, with that I will conclude. I think we have to start thinking about what it's going to be like when it's over. Or how are we going to resume our lives? Is this just going to be a bump in the road and we're going to go back to exactly the way we were? Or are we going to be changed? Are we going to be different? Are we going to be, in some respects, better people as a result of this? And that takes away some of the senselessness and some of the sort of like, who needs this type of attitude towards this very rough time that we're going through. And I think now's the time to start thinking about, what are we learning, especially during the high holy days? What are we learning? What can we do differently when we don't have to socially distance, when we don't have to wear masks, when we don't have to be in such dread of being around other people? How are we going to be different and maybe even better people? I want to just conclude, there's a very interesting story that's brought in the Talmud. It's brought to the end of the tractate of Masechta Sanhedrin about, I'm going to give you the very abridged version because it's a fairly long story, but it tells about during the Churban, during the destruction of the temple, 2 Jews were captured by a Roman, and now their future was pretty dismal. I mean, at best, they would be sold as slaves in a foreign country before there was a Geneva Convention and before there was email, and more likely they were going to be executed. And as he's taking them away, way ahead of them were 2 people walking with a camel. And one of the Jewish captives says to the other, you know, that camel, he's blind in one eye, and he's carrying two flasks, one's with wine, one with oil, and the two people eating them, one's a Jew and one's an Arab. And the Roman says, how do you know? So they go through the whole deal, how they figured that out. And he runs ahead and he sees they're right. And he takes, and he hadn't changed them, and he dances around them. He says, the Jews will always triumph. So it's a very strange story. I mean, from this we know that Jews are going to triumph. It's a Sherlock Holmes story. What do we know from this? And I think the message, and I think it's relevant for us coping now, is what helps us cope? How did we survive the Inquisition? How did we survive the Crusades? How do we survive the Holocaust? As we look down the road, we look ahead. We don't stay mired in what's happening right now. We project ourselves and we see that we're going somewhere, there's a future, there's some purpose, even if it's abstruse to us, there's some purpose to everything we're going through, and we can try to look ahead. And I think when things get really rough, and they are rough, and as I said, psychologically, this is the worst time. And maybe we have to just remove ourselves from the presence and look ahead and see what we can learn, see what we can gain, and see that there's going to be a better future ahead of us. I hope that's been helpful, and I think we have a few minutes for now for some questions, comments, etc.
You ended, Dr. Blumenthal, with the message about how do we resume our lives after COVID, that people should be thinking about post-COVID. It ends, as you mentioned, things come to an end, crises are over, we just don't know when. And let's think about during this time how we're going to resume our normal lives while we're still in the thick of it. And I describe it as the silver lining of COVID. There are silver linings. Terrible things have happened. Unfortunately, we've lost family members, loved ones. People have been sick. People have had serious side effects from COVID. At the same time, what are the silver linings? What are the positive things that we take from any bad situation? Dr. Blumenthal provided a context, what he described as two templates for the attenders and the distractors, those individuals that pay great attention to detail, want to know what's going on. It helps them cope, versus people who are distractors, who don't need all the details, who don't need all the information, and that helps them cope. And you don't want to try to make an attender a distractor, and don't try to make a distractor an attender. They are who they are. We've gotten many questions while you folks were speaking, and I'd like to combine several questions. Dr. Kirschenbaum and Dr. Blumenthal into the following context, if you will. Anxiety, of course, is a major issue that everyone is discussing now. Stress, anxiety, worry, call it by any name. Let's distinguish for a moment between the adult and the child. And I'll give you several examples. Please comment on it. There's the constant conversation that COVID will not reoccur by those that are sick, antibodies and so on and so forth. Okay, so adults can process that. At the same time, Dr. Kirschenbaum mentioned that isolation is 10 days. If you come into contact with someone who's positive, it's 14 days. So children may come into contact with someone and then they're in isolation or they're in quarantine. You explain it to them. They struggle through it. You know, there's fun and games, but at some point, obviously it's difficult. And then they go out, wherever they go, on a play date, they go out to family, to school, and then lo and behold, they're in a class, they did nothing wrong, someone tested positive, and now, or two kids in a class, and now the class has to stay home, or this 8-year-old has to stay home. So, Dr. Kirschenbaum, explain to a kid why he has to stay home and quarantine or be in isolation for the second or the third time. I didn't do anything wrong. Why do I have to stay home?
Yeah, so there's a quite a bit of stigma attached to being positive for coronavirus, and as well, some stigma associated with being in quarantine, where the child automatically assumes that he did something wrong, like sitting in the corner with a dunce cap or getting punished or grounded. They feel like they've done something wrong. And I've taken the opportunity in the room, and I encourage parents as well, let those children know that they didn't do anything wrong, that they're perfect. And the reason why we're doing the quarantine and doing the isolation protocols as best as you can, as a developmental doctor, that's what pediatricians do. Every child can understand things on their age appropriate behavior, and not every child that's the same age understands the same concepts the same. So you as a parent really know your child best, and you need to explain to them using, age appropriate words that you're doing this as a chesed, you're doing this as compassion for your fellow classmates, for your rebbe or teacher or mora. You're doing it for your grandparents, and the reason why you're not leaving the house is for other people's sake, that you don't want to get them sick. And even though you feel fine because you're thankfully healthy, there's still a concern that you can go ahead and spread that to other people. And I feel like most children, being that we're raising them in these schools where chesed is talked about so much, when you compare it to some other things that we do as a community for the sake of other people, even though it comes at our personal expense, whether it's giving charity or it's visiting sick people in a nursing home or wishing a great-grandmother or grandmother a good Shabbos. There are certain things that we do that in order to understand an abstract concept, which adults are having a hard time understanding, which is quarantine and isolation. When we compare it, or we bridge that idea to some other concept that they already know, I find that that's the most helpful way to reach the child.
Connected to another concept that they're familiar with. Dr. Blumenthal, any thoughts, please?
No, I think that's a very good approach. The only thing I would add, particularly for the younger children, is to remember that when children are distraught or confused, they're very often listening not just to your words, because we tend to look at children sometimes as just these small adults, and adults listen to each other's words, but children are listening to your voice tone, to the quiver in your voice, to your body language, and therefore, again, it speaks to being clear yourself and conveying that sort of certainty. There's nothing, I know, for example, we as part of the Ohel trauma team, when I have to go into a school after a tragedy or something like that, I guarantee you that when I'm driving there, I'm a wreck. And when I leave, I'm a mess. But when I walk into that building, I act very sure of myself, because the children are distraught. And if this outside expert comes and he himself is falling apart, that's not going to, he can say all the right words, it's not going to help. So just be cognizant of how you're communicating to children in beyond just the words that you use.
Dr. Blumenthal, a parent asks, I've been doing everything I possibly can to stay focused on my family, to stay positive. I've been following everyone's advice. I think I'm doing a pretty decent job at helping my kids understand that during this difficult time, there's also fun times, the silver linings. We spend more time with family. They've gotten to know more people more, and the Zooms can be fun also. But Dr. Blumenthal, I'm running out of steam. Help me stay positive.
So your first mistake is following everybody's advice. I mean, but no, on a more serious note, I think there's a misconception, and I want to maybe try to clarify that. People think that having a positive attitude means laughing, smiling, playing games, entertaining. You can acknowledge the difficulty, you can acknowledge that it's very trying, and you can even reflect to a certain extent how difficult this is for you, and still at the same time have a positive attitude. So we don't have to deny the hardship in order to convey a positive attitude. We can impart that this is difficult. It's even difficult for mommy and daddy, but we have the wherewithal to handle it. We know that this is going to ultimately resolve itself. In other words, so I want to dispel this myth that we have to that a positive attitude is an amusement park. A positive attitude is, as I said, in fact, for example, I mean, it's again, I think it's sort of related. One of the, after the terrible Sassoon fire a number of years ago, where so many children were killed, the most common question we got asked was, can I cry in front of my children? Or from teachers, can I cry in front of my students? And the answer we gave them was, you can't shriek and scream and tear your hair out. But if tears roll down your cheek while you're talking, that's reality. This was a terrible situation. And that's, if anything, that's a positive experience, positive message to children. So I think that it's perfectly okay to say, I'm exhausted. This is hard, but I'm going to do it. Because we're raising children. We hope that their lives will be a charmed life. So we don't know that, in all likelihood, they'll face other challenges they grow up. And I think it's very good to model that we don't have to deny how hard something it is in order to have a positive attitude.
A very strong message, showing emotion in front of your children that's tempered, not showing extreme fear, but showing concern. Crying is a normal reaction. Dr. Kirschenbaum, how do I balance my need for normalcy with the real fear I have about exposing my family?
So it's important to remember that as parents, we have a responsibility to our children to create that environment. That's one of the I'd say it's probably the most important responsibility as parents that we do is to help create an environment which can foster growth, both spiritually and physically, in a safe environment. So even though we, like Dr. Blumenthal just mentioned, as adults can definitely relate to that anxiety that you just mentioned, which is getting others sick, even within our home or our children. Every time we drop them off at school or put them on that bus, we hold our breath and we feel a pit in our stomach. We have to remind ourselves that we're doing what the community leaders are telling us is safe to do in a safe manner. And yes, they may bring it back home. And like you mentioned earlier, there may be a classmate that may have it on that day, that maybe other parents aren't being as careful or are being as careful, and it was an honest mistake. So that is a real tangible fear. But as long as there's, again, no immediate family members with significant medical histories, it's important to remember that it is a virus. It's deadlier than anything else we've seen before, and it's new, so there's a lot of information that we don't know. But for your immediate family member, even if they were to get it, it's more at the isolation and quarantining time-wise, where it's more of a disturbance to our regular work schedule and life schedule that's affected more than it would be medically at this point, that we saw, let's say, 6 months ago. So we have to create that normalcy, and how to go about doing that. I think if we just take even half or 3/4 of what Dr. Blumenthal mentioned earlier, I think that will help you really enable to create that environment. And as you know, I can just second what you guys sort of just talked about regarding showing emotion in front of your children. Please, that is creating an appropriate environment for them, for sure.
Dr. Blumenthal, I'd like to touch on with something that both of you talked about, coping mechanisms. It's a conversation that in itself could take an hour. Could you list 3 main coping mechanisms that adults use versus 3 main coping mechanisms that children use? 3 and 3 for adults and for children. They may be similar, but what are the main areas, coping mechanisms?
So first of all, talking is very important in trauma. It's very interesting that there are a host of studies that show that if somebody experienced something traumatic, and we're right now in the midst of it, but if let's say somebody's experiencing something traumatic, and let's say if they would gauge their level of trauma, and then they discuss it and talk about it, it feels less traumatic. And it's not that the actual objective rate of trauma has changed. The objective, let's say, exposure to danger hasn't changed. But when it's ensconced in words, when you put it into words, it's almost like you have a certain mastery over it. So don't try to be strong and silent. That's not the point. You can be strong and verbal. And I think that's important. And the other thing is also sharing, again, it's a study that I mention almost at every webinar, the famous study about climbing the hill, where they took people to a very steep hill with a heavy backpack and asked them to climb the hill and estimate how hard it is. And the difference was one group climbed alone, the other one climbed it with friends. And those who climbed it with friends estimated the hill as less steep. talk to your friends, share it. This is a communal challenge, and if we feel like we're doing it together, it'll be more manageable. And take your pulse. Know yourself. I keep coming back to that. What the conclusion of all trauma experts is, it doesn't matter what coping mechanism you use, as long as you know yourself and what works for you. As I said earlier, what works for Reuven could be toxic for Shimon. So, look inside and think about in the past. Think what works for you and do what works for you. Also, by the way, it's important that you're not spending the whole day thinking about it. You need to focus on it. You have to. It's a reality. It's a real danger, but you have to take breaks from it as well. Children will very much, first of all, the difference between children and adults is children are looking towards us. And they're going to, what we do is going to be important, and our level of equanimity or realistic concern is going to be what they're going to replicate. What we have to be careful with children is that they don't, some misconceptions that what happens isn't relegated to fantasy. And especially today, in the age of information, we're very open with children. So we need to talk to them, and we need to also make it very clear to children that there's no such thing as a question that they can't ask. That they don't have to worry about destabilizing or upsetting us. Whatever's on their mind, whatever concerns they have, and just keep in mind as well that children have a knack for asking the most difficult questions at the single most inconvenient time. So, that's just, I don't know, it's in their DNA. But it's really when you're most harried and exhausted and then don't have a moment, that's when they're going to come and ask you the most challenging question, but that's kids.
I think also the comment that you made about the two mental platforms of attenders and distractors probably apply to children also.
And sure.
That if you as a parent on an attender or an attender and you need information, you need to know what's going on, your child is a distractor, they just don't need to know a lot of stuff and they just want to go off. Allow them to be that way. Sure. Don't turn them into who you are.
Right. That's true about everything in parenting. Absolutely.
Dr. Kirschenbaum, Dr. Blumenthal, thank you very much for joining this evening. Thank you very much, everyone. Ohel will continue these conversations on dealing with COVID. And a comment, just to conclude the evening, there's a lot of uncertainty there. Today, there will continue to be uncertainty tomorrow. Certainly, we hear a lot of information coming at us from so many different ways. It's important for us to take that information, couple it with our knowledge, speak to people whose advice we value, whoever that may be. And certainly in the case of children when we're not sure what to do, whether it's our principal, our pediatrician, whoever it may be, and then it's up to us as parents to make the most informed decision. Sometimes it's only with 90% of the information, and that's the best that we can do. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
We'll see you another time.
Happy and healthy New Year to everybody.
Happy, healthy year and a happy, healthy Yom Kippur. Everyone should stay safe and be well.